My brother creates viral rage bait content. I found the contract. He's a subject in a psychological study on the neurological effects of performative anger. It was tucked inside a ridiculously oversized textbook on behavioral psychology, which he was using to prop up one of his monitors. The irony is so thick, I feel like I'm choking on it. I was just looking for the spare car key. His room, as usual, was a disaster zone of tangled cables, empty energy drink cans, and discarded takeout containers. It's the price of living with an influencer, I guess. The air has this permanent staticky hum from all the electronics, and there's always a ring light somewhere, glaring like a single unblinking eye. I lifted the heavy book, and a sheaf of papers slid out, stapled at the corner. It looked official, with a letterhead from some university department I'd never heard of. Project Chimera, it said at the top. My heart started doing this weird, heavy thud against my ribs. I knew I shouldn't read it. It felt like a violation of his privacy, but his online life has been one giant violation of our peace and quiet for the last 2 years. So I read it, and the floor just kind of fell away. It wasn't a sponsorship deal. It wasn't a brand collaboration. It was a participant agreement, a consent form. My brother, Leo, wasn't just some guy yelling about video games and movie trailers for ad revenue. He was Subject 7B. He was being paid to perform, to simulate, and to escalate rage, all while researchers monitored everything. His heart rate, his vocal stress patterns, his pupil dilation. There were clauses about periodic fMRI scans and blood work to track hormonal changes, sustained cortisol levels, amygdala response. You've probably seen his stuff, even if you don't know his name. He calls himself Leo the Lion. He'll take the most insignificant, trivial piece of pop culture news, a casting choice for a superhero movie, a change in a video game's menu screen, and he'll just explode. His face gets red, a vein bulges in his forehead, and he screams until his voice goes hoarse. He gesticulates wildly, knocking things over on his desk for effect. It's a performance. I always knew that. It had to be. The Leo in those videos isn't the brother who taught me how to ride a bike, the one who'd stay up late helping me with my math homework even when he was exhausted. The real Leo is quiet. He's gentle. He rescues spiders from the bathtub and puts them outside. But seeing it in black and white, clinical and cold, changed everything. The contract detailed a payment schedule, scaling up based on the veracity and intensity of the emotional simulation. It was a script. They weren't just observing him, they were directing him. There were appendices with suggestions for topics known to elicit high engagement negative responses. They were feeding him the rage, and he was serving it up on a platter for clicks, views, and their precious data. He wasn't an entertainer, he was a specimen, a lab rat in a cage made of fiber optic cables and algorithm-fueled hate. I put the papers back exactly where I found them, my hands shaking so badly I could barely align the edges. I could hear him through his bedroom door, which he keeps closed and soundproofed now. He was recording. That fake, grating laugh he uses for his outros echoed faintly through the wall, and a wave of nausea washed over me. He's in there, performing his anger for an audience of millions, and an audience of one, a researcher with a clipboard taking notes on how my brother is slowly, methodically breaking his own brain for a paycheck. I backed out of his room, closing the door as quietly as I could. The spare car key was forgotten. All I could think about was the man on the other side of that door and the strangers in lab coats who were pulling his strings. I stumbled away from his door and into the living room, sinking into the old armchair that's been in our family for decades. The fabric felt rough against my skin. The silence in the house was different now. It wasn't peaceful, it was a vacuum, the space between his performed screams. My own breathing was too loud, too ragged. I could still feel the phantom weight of the papers in my hand, the clinical, detached language burning itself into my memory. Subject 7B. 2 words and a number. That's what he was to them. Not Leo. Not my brother. Just a data point in Project Chimera. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to stop the shaking, but it was deep, coming from somewhere in my bones. The whole world had tilted on its axis, and I was sliding off. Everything in our shared space was suddenly an artifact from a psychological experiment. The sleek new microphone box sitting by the recycling bin wasn't a celebratory purchase, it was equipment for the lab. The stack of energy drinks on the kitchen counter wasn't a bad habit, it was a stimulant to induce a heightened state for observation. I thought about how tired he always seemed. He'd sleep for 10, 12 hours on his off days, and I just assumed it was the weird schedule of an internet personality. But it wasn't, was it? It was the crash, the inevitable, soul-crushing crash after flooding your body with manufactured stress hormones for hours on end. He wasn't recovering from work, he was recovering from being a test subject. The headaches he complained about, the way he'd rub his eyes until they were red and raw, I'd told him to spend less time in front of the screen. What a joke. The screen wasn't the problem. The problem was what the screen was demanding from him and what the people behind it were extracting. I remembered a fight we had about 3 months ago. It was stupid, something about the dishes. I'd made a comment about him pulling his weight and he just broke. Not his online persona, not Leo the lion, but my brother. He didn't yell. His voice went quiet, and he looked at me with this hollowed-out expression I'd never seen before. He said, "You have no idea how tired I am. You have no idea what it takes." He looked so brittle, so fragile, that I immediately backed down and apologized. At the time, I thought he was being overly dramatic, stressed from the pressure to stay relevant. But now, replaying his words, they were a confession. He wasn't talking about making videos. He was talking about the performance, about the toll it was taking to slice off a piece of his own sanity and serve it up for their data collection day after day. He was telling me he was drowning, and I just told him to do the dishes. The click of his bedroom door opening sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through me. I froze, my body tensing like a cornered animal. He walked into the kitchen, and the first thing I noticed was how pale he was. The harsh fluorescent light washed him out, making him look almost transparent. The red-faced, vein-popping caricature he played online was gone. This was just Leo. He was wearing an old, faded t-shirt and rubbing the back of his neck, his shoulders slumped in a way that spoke of a deep, cellular exhaustion. He didn't see me at first, just shuffled to the fridge and pulled out a bottle of water, drinking half of it in one long, desperate pull. When he finally turned, he flinched, not expecting me to be sitting there in the dark. "Jesus," he breathed, his voice hoarse and gravelly. "Long one today," he said, trying for a casual tone. "The algorithm gods demand a sacrifice." He attempted a small smile, but it was a weak, tired thing that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes, that's what got me. They looked like old photographs. The color leached out of them. They were looking right at me, but I wasn't sure he was really seeing me. He was seeing the ghost of the rage he'd just spent 3 hours simulating. Then his gaze sharpened, focusing on my face. A flicker of concern, of the real Leo, crossed his features. "Hey, you okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." The irony was so bitter it felt like acid in my throat. I'd seen the ghost of my brother in a contract, his humanity itemized and sold for parts. I had to say something, anything, to fill the screaming silence. My mouth felt dry, my tongue like a piece of sandpaper. "Yeah," I managed to choke out, forcing my lips into a shape that might pass for a smile. "Yeah, just tired. Long day." He nodded slowly, accepting it. Of course he accepted it. Why wouldn't he? In his world, everyone was tired. Everyone was performing. He turned back to the fridge, looking for something to eat, and I just watched him, my heart a cold, heavy stone in my chest. He was right there, 3 meters away, and he had never felt so far. I was on the outside of the glass, watching the experiment unfold, and I was completely, utterly alone with it. I watched him pull out a plastic container of leftover pasta, the sauce congealed into a dull orange ring around the edges. He didn't bother to heat it up. He just grabbed a fork and started eating it cold, leaning against the counter with his eyes half closed. Every mechanical movement, every scrape of the fork against the plastic felt amplified in the silence. This wasn't a man eating dinner. This was a machine refueling. The contract mentioned diet logs. Was this part of it? Was he supposed to be eating this? Or was he just too drained to care about something as human as a warm meal? He was consuming calories, pure and simple, the same way you'd pour gasoline into a car. There was no pleasure in it, no satisfaction, just necessity. He was a body, and the body needed to keep running for the next performance. "You sure you're okay?" he asked again, his mouth full. His voice was thick with exhaustion and pasta. He still wasn't really looking at me, his gaze fixed on some point on the far wall. "You're being weirdly quiet." I swallowed, the sound loud in my own ears. "I'm fine, Leo, just a long day," I repeated, the lie tasting like ash. It was the only script I had. He grunted in acknowledgement, accepting my flimsy excuse because it was easier than probing. He probably didn't have the energy for it anyway. That was part of the design, wasn't it? Keep the subject too tired to question anything, too depleted to notice the walls of the cage closing in. He finished the pasta, rinsed the container with a startling lack of interest, and left it by the sink. He was on autopilot. He shuffled over to the couch opposite me and collapsed into it, the springs groaning in protest. He let his head fall back against the cushions and closed his eyes. For a second, he looked like the little brother I grew up with. I was suddenly thrown back to a memory from years ago, before any of this. We were teenagers, and he'd spent an entire weekend building a ridiculously intricate model of the Millennium Falcon. He didn't talk to anyone for 2 days, just sat at the kitchen table with a tiny pair of tweezers and a bottle of glue, his brow furrowed in absolute concentration. When he finally placed the last piece, he didn't cheer or shout. He just sat back with this quiet, profound look of satisfaction on his face, a creator's piece. Where was that person now? They had taken that focused, patient energy and twisted it, inverted it. They'd taught him how to break things instead of build them, how to scream instead of think, and they convinced him it was a more valuable skill. "Had my weekly review call today," he mumbled, his eyes still closed. My blood ran cold. A review call. Not with a manager, not with a YouTube rep. A review call with his handlers. "Metrics are up again," he continued, a faint, tired hint of pride in his voice. "They said the spike in my heart rate during the rant about the coffee shop was optimal for engagement. They want more of that." He let out a dry, humorless laugh. Optimal for engagement. Sounds like something a robot would say, right? He didn't know how right he was. He was talking about the researchers. They were giving him notes on his own biological responses. They weren't just directing his performance, they were monitoring his vitals like a hospital patient, and he was interpreting it as career advice. My throat tightened. He was a frog in a pot of slowly boiling water, and he thought the warmth was success. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him by the shoulders, shake him, and yell, "They're not trying to make you famous, Leo. They're studying you. They're dissecting you while you're still alive." But the words wouldn't come. I thought of the contract, of the dense paragraphs of legalese. There would be a non-disclosure agreement, ironclad and terrifying. If I told him and he tried to get out, what would they do? Would they sue him into oblivion, release his data, ruin his life in a way that would make his online rage look like a pleasantry? By telling him the truth, I could inadvertently trigger the very destruction I was trying to prevent. My silence felt like a betrayal, but speaking felt like a detonation. So I sat there, paralyzed by the knowledge, a co-conspirator in my brother's slow-motion self-immolation. He thought I was just his sister, his roommate. He had no idea I was now the sole unwilling audience member who knew the whole show was a lie. He shifted on the couch, the leather sighing under his weight. "They're even sending me some new gear," he added, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the air. "Some kind of wrist-based monitor, supposed to give me real-time feedback on my energy levels, so I can modulate my performance arc during a stream. He said it all so matter-of-factly, as if he were talking about a new microphone or a better camera. He didn't hear the clinical chill in those words, a performance arc. They were scripting his emotional outbursts like a 3-act play. And the wrist monitor? They were going to feed his own biological data back to him, turning his very pulse into a tool for his own manipulation. He would see a number dip and know he needed to get angrier. He would be chasing a high score written in his own blood pressure. It was a perfect, self-sustaining loop of manufactured rage, and they were giving him the controls, making him feel like the pilot when he was just the engine they were running into the ground. My own heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic, panicked drumbeat. What would my metrics look like right now? Probably not optimal. That sounds high-tech, I managed to say. The words felt like tiny, useless stones I was tossing into a canyon. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. Yeah, big investment. They said if I can keep this quarter's growth trajectory, I'm in line for a significant bonus. Might even be enough to get our own place, So you don't have to live with your crazy, screaming brother anymore. He tried for a joke, a sliver of the old Leo, the one who was always protective, always worried he was being a burden. The sentiment was so pure, so fundamentally him, that it was like a knife twisting in my gut. He was doing all of this, putting himself through this psychological meat grinder for us, for me, and he thought the cage they were building around him was a foundation for a better life. The silence stretched again, thick and heavy with everything I couldn't say. I watched the slow, even rise and fall of his chest. He was drifting off, right there on the couch. The exhaustion was more than just physical. It was a soul-deep weariness. They were running him ragged, keeping him in a constant state of depletion, where a significant bonus was a bright, shining light at the end of a tunnel, blinding him to the fact that the tunnel was collapsing behind him. I couldn't just sit here. I couldn't let him wake up in the morning and strap on their monitor and dive back into the abyss without doing something. The paralysis was starting to burn away, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged anger of my own. It wasn't the performative, hollow rage he was paid to produce. It was real, and it was aimed squarely at the invisible men on the other end of that review call. I stood up, my joints cracking in protest. Leo's eyes fluttered open for a second. "Where are you going?" he mumbled. "Just getting some water," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. It was a lie, but it was a start. I walked into the kitchen, my movements stiff and deliberate. I didn't get a glass of water. I went to the junk drawer, the one filled with old takeout menus, rubber bands, and dead batteries. My fingers rummaged past the clutter until they closed around what I was looking for, the spare key to his office. He always kept his door locked when he was streaming, and lately he'd started locking it even when he wasn't. He called it protecting his workspace, but I now understood it for what it was, protecting the experiment's integrity. He didn't know he was the one being protected from the truth. I palmed the small, cold piece of metal. My plan was vague, a frantic scramble of thoughts. I had to see more. The contract was the what, but I needed the how and the why. His computer would have everything, his emails with his handlers, the raw data from their monitors, the diet logs, the performance notes. It had to be there. I looked back at the living room. Leo was already asleep, his head lolled to one side, his breathing deep and even. He looked so vulnerable, like a child. My protector, the one who thought he was building us a future, fast asleep while the vultures circled. My decision solidified. I couldn't wake him up to the nightmare. Not yet. Not without a weapon, not without a plan. First, I had to walk into the nightmare myself and map its corners. I had to go into his office. I had to see just how deep this really went. The key felt heavy in my palm, its familiar jagged edges now feeling alien and sharp. Every sound in the apartment was amplified. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint whisper of traffic from the street below, the impossibly loud sound of my own breathing. I stood there for a full minute, my gaze fixed on Leo's sleeping form. His face, usually animated and expressive even in repose, was slack with a profound, almost unnerving exhaustion. This wasn't just sleep, it was a system shutdown. The guilt of what I was about to do was a physical weight in my chest, a dense, cold pressure. I was about to violate his trust, his one private space in the most profound way. But the image of that wrist monitor, of him chasing his own rising blood pressure like a video game score, burned hotter than the guilt. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a rescue mission. I crept down the short hallway, each footstep a calculated, silent placement on the floorboards. The door to his office was a dark, imposing rectangle at the end of the hall. I slid the key into the lock, the metal-on-metal sound like a gunshot in the stillness. I held my breath, listening for any stirring from the living room. Nothing, just the deep, rhythmic sound of his breathing. I turned the key. The click of the lock tumbling open was a point of no return. I pushed the door inward, and it swung open with a soft hydraulic sigh. I slipped inside and closed it behind me, plunging myself into the near-total darkness, the only light a thin sliver from under the door and the blinking blue LED of his computer's sleep mode. The air in the room was different, stale and charged, like the air after a thunderstorm. It smelled of ozone from the electronics and that cloyingly sweet scent of the energy drinks he was now constantly sipping. My eyes adjusted slowly. The familiar shape of his gaming chair, the massive curved monitors on his desk, the acoustic foam panels on the walls. But there were new things.
A small whiteboard I'd never seen before was mounted on the wall. On it, in his familiar scrawl, were diagrams that looked like flowcharts connected to phrases like inciting incident, sustained outrage, and climax resolution. It looked like a writer's story map, but the subject was his own emotional state. On a small side table were neat rows of blister packs, supplements, I guessed, and a logbook. I didn't need to open it. I knew what I would find. They were controlling his diet, his sleep, his entire physiology to make him a more reliable instrument. The room wasn't his office anymore. It was a cage. It was a laboratory. I moved to the desk and gently tapped the mouse. The monitors flickered to life, bathing the room in a cold white glow and displaying a password screen. My heart sank. Of course it was password protected. My mind raced through old passwords, birthdays, pet names. Nothing. Then my eyes caught it. Tucked just under the edge of the monitor stand was a yellow sticky note. In his handwriting, it said, Project Optimal 22. My blood ran cold. He hadn't even come up with his own password. They had given it to him, branded his private login with their clinical jargon, and he'd accepted it without a second thought. I typed it in, my fingers trembling slightly. The desktop materialized, a chaotic mess of game icons and video files, a stark contrast to the sterile order of the rest of the room. I ignored it all and went straight for his email client. The inbox loaded, a long list of messages, most with the same sender, a generic, corporate-sounding address from the Performance Analytics Group. The subject lines were chillingly detached. Session review, 11:05. Biometric feedback integration. Updated nutritional protocol. There was no, hey Leo, no friendly chatter. It was all business. I clicked on the most recent session review. It wasn't a message. It was a report. Graphs charted his heart rate variability, his galvanic skin response, his vocal pitch and cadence. Beside them were time-stamped notes. 2114. Subject deployed prescribed rhetorical device. Note corresponding 8% increase in GSR. Effective. 4530. Vocal stress indicators dipped below optimal threshold. Recommend re-engaging with stimulus topic 4B in next session. They were writing about my brother like a lab rat. Stimulus topic 4B. I knew what that was. It was the time he'd bring up our mom, how the insurance company had fought us after her diagnosis. It was his most genuine, painful memory, and they had cataloged it, weaponized it, and assigned it a code, a tool to be re-engaged with, to make a number on a chart go up. A wave of nausea washed over me. I felt like I was going to be sick right there, all over his meticulously organized lab. I swallowed hard, forcing it down, and kept digging. I had to see it all. Tucked in a folder labeled Project Resources was a document that made my breath catch in my throat. It was titled Phase 2 Proposal, Emotional Contagion and Audience Impact Study.
My finger hovered over the mouse, a millimeter of air separating me from the truth I'd been hunting for. A part of me, the part that still remembered building pillow forts with Leo in the living room, screamed at me to stop, to close the computer, lock the door, and pretend none of this was real. But the image of his exhausted face, the cold clinical language of the session reviews, it pushed me forward. I clicked. The document opened and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't written in normal language. It was a dense academic text filled with charts and impenetrable jargon. But I understood enough. I understood the title of the first section, The Subject as Vector, a Model for Scalable Emotional Transfer. My brother wasn't just the subject anymore. He was the vector, the carrier of the disease they were studying. They were using him to infect his audience.
I scrolled, my eyes scanning words that felt like they were from a different, colder planet. Neuro-linguistic triggers, parasocial amplification, sentiment mapping. They were tracking his viewers, every single one of them. The proposal laid it all out. They had software that analyzed the chat in real time, flagging keywords, tracking user engagement, and sorting viewers into receptivity cohorts. They were A/B testing Leo's scripted outrage. On Tuesday, he might use the phrase, "It's an absolute betrayal," and they would measure the spike in negative sentiment keywords in the chat. On Thursday, he'd be instructed to say, "They're laughing at you," and they'd compare the data, refining their methods, finding the exact words to make thousands of anonymous people feel angry or helpless or victimized. They were building a dictionary of outrage. My brother was just the machine they used to speak it. The nausea from before returned, hot and acidic in the back of my throat. This wasn't for his health. It wasn't about performance. It was about them. It was about his audience. Those kids, those lonely people who flooded his chat with messages of support, who saw him as a champion, someone who was angry for them. They weren't his community. They were his other lab rats, unwitting, unpaid, and unprotected. I saw attachments in the document, spreadsheets and data visualizations. I opened one. It was a network graph, a spider web of interconnected dots. In the center was a large node labeled Vector L, Leo. Branching out from him were thousands of smaller dots, each one a viewer's username. The lines connecting them were color-coded based on their emotional contagion score. A cold dread washed over me as I recognized some of the names from the stream I'd watched. There was Night Slayer 94, the one who had spammed angry capital letters for an hour straight. His dot was bright red, with thick lines connecting him to dozens of other users he'd argued with. He wasn't just a fan. He was a success metric. Then I saw it, a small section in the proposal titled Monetization Potentials. It was vague, corporate, and terrifying. It spoke of partnering with third-party brands to leverage high arousal states for optimized consumer conversion. It meant getting people angry and then selling them something while they weren't thinking clearly. An energy drink, a VPN, a political ideology, anything. They were perfecting a new kind of weapon, and my brother, my kind, protective brother who used to check for monsters under my bed, was the one pulling the trigger, over and over again, without even knowing it was loaded. The last shred of my guilt about being in his office evaporated, replaced by a cold, clear rage that felt nothing like Leo's manufactured performances. This was real. This was mine. They had turned my brother into a monster, and they were using that monster to hurt people. I wasn't just on a rescue mission anymore. This was a demolition. I rummaged through the dress drawers, my hands shaking with adrenaline, until I found what I was looking for, a small black flash drive. I plugged it into the USB port. A tiny light on the drive blinked to life. I found a main Project Optimal folder and dragged it over to the drives icon. The progress bar appeared.
copying 4,312 items. It was going to take time I wasn't sure I had. Every tick of the progress bar felt like a hammer blow against my ribs. 10%, 15%. My eyes were glued to the screen, but my ears were straining, listening for any sound from the other room. And then I heard it. A soft groan, the sound of shifting weight on the couch cushions. My blood turned to ice. I froze. My hand still on the mouse, my breath caught in my chest. The progress bar crept to 22%. Then the unmistakable, terrifying sound of a floorboard creaking in the hallway. My whole body went rigid. It was a single dry crack of wood under pressure, but it might as well have been a gunshot in the silent apartment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I could hear the blood rushing in my ears, a roar that almost drowned out the soft hum of the computer tower. The progress bar on the screen was a taunting green sliver, agonizingly slow. 24%. My hand was frozen on the mouse, my knuckles white. I didn't dare breathe. Another sound came, a low mumble of sleep-thick confusion from the hallway, and then the unmistakable squeak of the hinges on his bedroom door. He wasn't on the couch anymore. He was up. He was moving. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through my paralysis. My mind raced, flickering through impossible scenarios. There was no way to explain this. The locked door, the lit-up screen filled with his entire secret life. It was over. But then the rage I'd felt just moments before flared again, a pilot light in the storm of fear. No, I wasn't getting caught. Not now, not when I had them. My fingers flew across the desk. I didn't close the window. There was no time. I just jabbed the power button on the monitor, plunging the screen into darkness. The room was instantly swallowed by shadow, the only light a faint glow from under the door and the insidious, rhythmic pulse of the tiny LED on the flash drive, a tiny, blinking beacon of my crime. I slid off the chair, silent as I could be, and squeezed myself into the knee-hole of the desk, pulling the chair in slightly to cover the opening. I curled into a ball, my knees pressed against my chest, the dusty smell of old carpet and tangled cables filling my nostrils. The doorknob rattled. My heart stopped. He was trying the handle, finding it locked. A moment of silence stretched into an eternity. Was he going to get the key? Was he going to shoulder the door down? I squeezed my eyes shut, picturing the file transfer. 35%? 40? Then I heard him sigh, a heavy, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of all his faked performances. Stupid, he muttered, his voice muffled by the door. I heard his footsteps retreat, then the sound of a cupboard opening in the kitchen, a glass being filled with water. He wasn't trying to get in. He had just found the door locked and given up. The relief was so intense it made me dizzy. I stayed folded in the darkness, listening to him move around the kitchen, the sounds of a normal person in the middle of the night, not a vector in a psychological experiment. He came back down the hall, and this time he didn't stop at the office. He went into the living room. The couch springs groaned as he settled back down. I waited, counting the seconds, my body screaming with cramps from my contorted position. The silence deepened again, broken only by the whir of the computer's fan. Slowly, cautiously, I uncurled myself and peered over the top of the desk. The flash drive was still blinking its patient, steady rhythm. I reached up and tapped the mouse. The monitor flickered to life, bathing my face in its cold blue light. 87%? My breath hitched. So close. I watched the green line fill the remaining space, my eyes darting toward the door with every tick. 95, 98, 100. Copy complete. I've never seen more beautiful words in my life. My movements were deft and silent. I right-clicked the drive's icon and selected Eject. I pulled the small black rectangle from the USB port. It felt warm in my hand, heavy with the proof I needed. I pocketed it, stood up, and took one last look around the room. It looked exactly the same, but for me, it was completely different. It was a crime scene, a laboratory, a prison. I unlocked the door as quietly as I could. The click of the latch sounded like a thunderclap in the still apartment. I crept into the hallway, my socked feet making no sound on the hardwood floor. In the living room, Leo was asleep on the couch again, his face turned away from me, one arm dangling toward the floor. His breathing was deep and even. For a terrifying second, I thought about waking him up, about throwing the flash drive on his chest and screaming until he understood. But looking at him, so vulnerable and exhausted, I knew I couldn't. It would be a cruelty, an ambush. He needed to be saved, not attacked. I slipped out the front door, closing it so gently that the lock didn't even click shut. The cold night air hit me like a physical blow, and I realized I was drenched in sweat. I didn't go to my car, I just walked. I walked for blocks, the city lights blurring around me, the flash drive, a hard, solid presence in my pocket. I couldn't go home. My apartment felt compromised, too close. It felt like they could be watching. A paranoid thought, but in the context of network graphs and sentiment mapping, it didn't feel entirely impossible. I found myself standing in front of an all-night diner, its fluorescent lights buzzing, a lonely sanctuary in the dark. I slid into a vinyl booth, the cracked red plastic cool against my skin. A waitress poured me a coffee I didn't touch. I just sat there, my hand in my pocket, wrapped around the flash drive. The anger was gone. The fear was subsiding, and in their place was a terrifying clarity. Showing this to Leo wasn't the endgame. It was just the first step. What if he didn't believe me? What if he was so deep in it, so dependent on the money or the validation, that he would choose to be their lab rat? They had insulated him with contracts and justifications. Just telling him could shatter him and solve nothing. The report, the proposal, the network graphs, this wasn't just about my brother anymore. It was about every single one of those colored dots on the screen. It was about the people running the study, the ones in their clean offices looking at their data and calling my brother's pain stimulus topic 4B. They weren't just going to let him walk away. I couldn't just pull him out. I had to burn the whole lab to the ground. The sun began to bleed over the horizon, turning the dark gray of the city into a bruised purple. My coffee was stone cold. I sat in that diner for hours, a ghost in a vinyl booth, while the world outside woke up and started its day. Commuters hurried past the window, faces set with the mundane concerns of work and deadlines, and I felt a million miles away from them. Burn the whole lab to the ground. It sounded so simple in my head, a righteous declaration in the dark of my brother's office, but sitting here, with the evidence feeling like a lead weight in my pocket, the reality of it was overwhelming. How does one person fight a university, a team of researchers with institutional backing and lawyers on retainer? They had insulated him with contracts and non-disclosure agreements around my brother, and I was just one person with a stolen key. They used the internet as their weapon, a sprawling, interconnected network to push and pull on the strings of human emotion. They had turned my brother into a node, a broadcast tower for their manufactured rage. The irony was suffocating. Their weapon had to become mine. The story of what they did, the raw data, the proof, it couldn't just be shown to Leo. It had to be broadcast to everyone. It needed to spread through the same digital veins they had so expertly exploited. It needed to be a fire they couldn't control. But it couldn't come from me. An anonymous data dump would be dismissed as a hoax, a conspiracy theory. It needed a voice of authority, someone with a reputation for digging up the truth and holding power to account. It needed a real journalist. My mind latched on to a name, Alana Cortez. She was a tech reporter for an online publication known for its long-form investigative pieces. A year ago, she had published a massive exposé on a social media company that was using its algorithm to quietly promote extremist content to keep users engaged. She faced down their legal team, protected her anonymous source, and won. I had read every word of that series. She wasn't just a reporter, she was a demolitions expert. She knew how to place charges to bring an entire corrupt structure down.
The thought sent a tremor of both hope and terror through me. This was the way. It was a terrifying all-or-nothing gamble, but it was the only move I had that felt bigger than their whole sick game. I left the diner and walked until I found a public library. The sterile quiet of the building was a balm on my frayed nerves. I sat at a public terminal, the keyboard cool and impersonal under my fingers, and created a new, anonymous email address. My hands were shaking as I composed the message to Alana Cortez. I kept it brief, professional, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. I wrote that I was a source with internal documents, data, and communications from a long-running, unethical psychological study conducted by a major university involving a prominent online content creator. I attached one file, the initial project proposal, the one that outlined their entire methodology. I spent 10 minutes meticulously redacting Leo's name and any identifying details from the PDF, replacing them with a simple black bar. I stared at the screen for a full minute, my finger hovering over the mouse. Then I clicked send. The email vanished into the ether. An invisible flare shot into the sky. The next few days were a special kind of hell. I went through the motions of my life in a fog, my entire consciousness tethered to the refresh button of that anonymous inbox. I barely slept. Every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped into my throat. I saw that Leo had tried to call me a few times. I couldn't answer. What would I even say? Hey, just wanted to check in. By the way, I stole all your secret corporate files and I'm about to detonate your entire career and personal life in a public forum. How's your Tuesday? The silence stretched on, and I began to despair. Maybe she thought it was a prank. Maybe she was too busy. Maybe I had failed. Then, on the fourth day, a reply appeared. It was 4 words long. I'm interested. Let's talk. The relief was so profound it almost buckled my knees. We communicated through encrypted channels, and after she'd verified more of the documents, we met. I handed her the flash drive. Letting it go felt like giving up a piece of myself, the physical totem of my anger and fear. She was exactly as I'd imagined, sharp, focused, and radiating a calm, unshakable intensity. She assured me that she would protect my identity, and more importantly, that she would handle my brother's involvement with care. She understood he was as much a victim as he was a perpetrator. When I walked away from that meeting, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. The bomb was no longer in my hands. The story broke a week later. It was an earthquake. Project Chimera, as the study was called, was the headline on every major news site. The university's name was dragged through the mud. The researchers were publicly named, their academic reputations incinerated in an instant. My phone exploded with notifications. Friends, cousins, my parents, everyone wanting to know if I'd seen the news about the study that seemed to describe Leo's channel perfectly. And then his name flashed on my screen. I watched it ring, my thumb hovering over the green button. I couldn't do it. I let it go to voicemail. This was the fallout I knew was coming, the shrapnel from the explosion. I had to let him feel the shockwave on his own to understand it from the outside before I could ever try to explain it from the inside. I finally drove to his apartment 2 days later. The news crews were gone, but the silence they left behind felt louder. I knocked, and after a long moment, the door opened. He stood there, framed in the doorway, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. The aggressive posture, the smirk, the performative anger, it was all gone. He just looked hollowed out. He wasn't the rage baiter from the videos, nor the vector from the study. He was just Leo, my brother. We stood there for a long time, the silence stretching between us, thick with everything that had happened. He didn't yell. He didn't cry. He just looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the ruins of the prison I had just demolished.
I chose to detonate a bomb in my brother's life because I believed the explosion was the only thing that could clear the poison from the air. But when you tear someone's world apart, even with the best intentions, are you saving them or are you just creating a different kind of cage? Let us know in the comments.
Don't forget to like and subscribe. I post new stories every day.